So you've picked up an Osmo Action 6 and you want to start shooting time lapses. Those magical little sequences that turn minutes, or even hours, into just a few seconds of cinematic motion. Well, in this video, I'm going to walk you through everything you need to get started. We'll start by capturing your very first time lapse, then see how tweaking things like your interval or shutter speed can completely change the mood of your footage. And to wrap things up, I'll share a handful of bonus tips, from why you might want to shoot in RAW, to adding movement for some extra momentum in your shot. But before we hit record, let's make sure we're on the same page about what a time-lapse actually is. At its core, a time-lapse is a series of photos, or individual frames, taken at regular intervals. When you string them together and play them back at your video's frame rate, say 24 or 30 FPS, time appears to be sped up in a captivating way. Clouds race across the sky, traffic turns into flowing streams of light, and people move like they're in fast forward. Now, on older cameras, creating a time-lapse meant manually stitching together all those individual photos yourself, which was a lot of work. Thankfully, the DJI Osmo Action 6 has a dedicated time-lapse mode that does all of that heavy lifting for you, capturing the frames and then compiling them directly into a ready-to-watch MP4 video file. There's just one more thing you'll need before you start though, which is somewhere to leave your camera while it does its thing. Ideally, that's a tripod, anything that can keep the camera completely steady for the entire duration of the time-lapse. But in a pinch, you can always get creative. A flat surface like a table or even the ground can also work. Alright, let's take a look at the dedicated time-lapse mode. To open it, tap the shooting mode in the bottom left corner, or just swipe left or right across the screen. Keep swiping until you reach the very last shooting mode. This is the time-lapse mode. Once you're in, swipe up from the bottom of the screen. This is where we set all the shooting parameters for the time-lapse. The first thing you'll want to change is the resolution. By default, the camera is set to record time-lapses in 1080p, but you'll almost always want to bump that up to 4K for sharper, cleaner results. You'll also see options for field of view. The default is wide, which captures the most scene, but can have a very noticeable fisheye-like distortion at the edges. If you want something a bit more natural, natural wide reduces that distortion. And if you want the straightest possible lines, choose standard, but just remember that this will give you the narrowest field of view of the three. Now those settings are ones you've probably already seen in the camera's other shooting modes. The time-lapse mode also has a few special time-lapse specific settings. First, you'll see the option to switch to hyperlapse. A hyperlapse is essentially a time-lapse that is taken when the camera itself is moving between frames rather than staying still. They can look incredible, but that's a topic for another day, so let's switch back and stick with the ordinary time-lapse. Next, we have the all-important scene selector. You'll see three basic presets here: crowds, clouds, and sunset. Here's what's important to understand. These presets only do one thing. They choose an interval, which is how long the camera will wait between taking each shot, and duration, which is how long the camera will keep shooting for you. That's it. They don't change the image processing, color, or exposure, so don't feel like you must select clouds just because you're filming clouds. For that reason, I always recommend using custom. Manually choosing your interval and duration is the fastest way to build your intuition and handle any scene that comes at you. So let's head out to the beach and capture our very first time-lapse. Since we're shooting a sunset, I'm going with a 3-second interval, which is what the DJI sunset preset suggests. But instead of a 1-hour duration, I'll set the duration to infinity. That basically tells the camera to keep shooting until I manually stop it. Once that's set, all I have to do is hit the record button, and the camera starts capturing a frame every 3 seconds. Now comes the hardest part of shooting time-lapses: waiting. Okay, it's been a while now and I'd like to make it home before dinner, so let's stop it here and see what we've got. And this right here is the resulting time-lapse. Pretty cool for a first shot. Now that we've shot our very first time-lapse, let's talk about interval, because this one setting can completely change how motion appears in your shot. The basic idea is this: the faster your subject is moving, the shorter your interval should be. For something like crowds or busy streets, short intervals keep people from teleporting across the frame and make the motion feel smoother and easier to follow. On the other hand, for slower subjects like drifting clouds or a sunset, you'll want to use a longer interval so that the movement becomes noticeable and visually interesting. And for extremely slow subjects, like a plant growing, you'll want a much longer interval, otherwise it will feel like you're watching paint dry in real time. Let's look at a few real examples I took. Here's a crowd scene shot with a longer 2-second interval. Everything feels a bit chaotic and jumpy. But when I switch to a half-second interval, the motion suddenly becomes smoother and more readable. You can actually follow the flow of people through the scene. In this example with waves, a 3-second interval makes the waves roll too fast and lose their natural rhythm. Reducing the interval makes the motion feel more natural and smooth. But for this sunset time-lapse, I did want the daylight to fade more quickly, so a slower 3-second interval worked better. And for this dramatic cloud time-lapse, I went all the way up to a 30-second interval, which creates this really striking effect where the clouds race across the sky. Now remember, if you shoot with a shorter interval, you can always speed up your time-lapse in post to mimic the look of a longer interval, since it's no problem to discard extra frames. But shoot with too long an interval, and you're locked in. You can't manually add frames you never captured, and slowing the footage down will almost always look unnatural. So when in doubt, go shorter. You'll keep your options open, though you will use more storage. And that storage issue gets very serious when shooting in RAW, which I'll discuss later. Now let's talk about shutter speed, because this is another setting that can dramatically change the look and feel of your time-lapses. When you use a slower shutter speed, moving elements in your scene start to blur, creating those smooth, cinematic motion trails. Faster shutter speeds do the opposite, they freeze motion and give your time-lapse a sharper, more staccato look. Neither is right or wrong, it just depends on the style you're going for. To manually control the shutter speed, you'll need to jump into Pro mode. Tap the slider icon on the right of the screen, and then enable Pro mode. From there, open the exposure settings and switch from Auto to Manual. This is where you can set the shutter speed yourself. Let's head outside and see how different shutter speeds actually affect a time-lapse. We'll start with a 1/30 shutter speed. Notice how the camera has cranked the ISO all the way up to over 17,000. Because the shutter is relatively fast, the sensor doesn't have much time to collect light, so the camera has to compensate by boosting ISO. And this is the time-lapse we get. Very little motion blur and pretty bad image quality. There's a lot of visible noise because the ISO is so high. Next, let's slow things down to 1/5 of a second. Now the ISO drops to around 2500 since the sensor has more time to gather light. The result is a cleaner image with noticeably less noise, and we're starting to see some motion blur creeping in. Now let's move to a 1-second shutter. This drops the ISO into the 500s and produces a really nice looking time-lapse with smooth motion trails and much better overall image quality. Finally, let's push it even further with a 3-second shutter. At this point, I can't use a 2-second interval anymore because the camera requires the interval to be longer than the shutter speed. So instead, I switch to a 4-second interval, which is the shortest option available here. The final result looks fantastic. We get the longest and smoothest light trails from the car so far, and the image quality is excellent with minimal noise. So as you can see, shooting with slower shutter speeds is a great way to introduce motion blur and add a more cinematic feel to your time lapses. Just be aware that doing this during the day is much harder, since slow shutter speeds in bright light will almost certainly blow out your image. To make this work, you'll need strong ND filters, which are basically sunglasses for your camera. I still don't own any for my Osmo Action 6, but with my Osmo Action 5 Pro, I was still overexposed during the day using the strongest ND64 I have, so look for even stronger ND ratings. So to wrap things up, let's go through a few miscellaneous tips that will help you get better time lapses out of the Osmo Action 6. The single most important one is to keep your ISO under control, especially when shooting in low light. High ISO absolutely destroys image quality, so I strongly recommend limiting the ISO range to something sensible, like 100 to 800 or 100 to 1600. That prevents the camera from choosing higher ISO values and instead forces the camera to use a slower shutter speed. If you're shooting with fully manual exposure and setting both ISO and shutter speed yourself, a good rule of thumb is to aim for an exposure value somewhere around -0.7 to +0.3 EV. You don't need to be perfect, just keep it around that ballpark. Next, consider switching the save format to video plus RAW. This gives you a set of raw DNG files alongside the finished video, each one containing the full sensor data from every captured frame. This yields a few big advantages. First, you can recover a surprising amount of shadow detail in post by lifting exposure, which is almost essential for things like night sky time lapses. Second, you get far more color grading flexibility, since you're working with uncompressed sensor data. And third, you unlock much more powerful noise reduction and image enhancement tools in post. Photo editors like Lightroom have extremely good AI noise reduction and enhancement features that simply aren't available when working with a compressed video file. The big caveat, of course, is that working with RAW files takes a lot more time, and the RAW files themselves take up a lot more space. Processing them, grading them, and stitching everything together is a lot of extra work, so I usually just end up using the video file the camera constructed for me. But I like to keep the RAW files just in case, especially because capturing time lapses already takes a lot of time and effort. And another small detail to keep in mind, the minute roll interval increases to 2 seconds instead of 0.5 seconds when your save format is set to video and RAW. Finally, let's talk about adding movement to your time lapses. Everything you've seen so far has been static, but introducing motion can make a sequence feel much more dynamic and engaging. Traditionally, this is done with sliders or motorized gimbals that physically move the camera during the capture. But because the Osmo Action 6 captures such a wide image, you can also cheat a bit and add movement in post. Simple pans, subtle push-ins, or even more stylized moves like flash zooms. And with that, you should have everything you need to start shooting great time lapses with the Osmo Action 6.